She pointed at the door like he was something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "I don't know what kind of place you think this is," Vanessa Reed said loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "But we don't serve people like you here." The man didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply picked up his jacket, glanced at his watch, and walked out into the morning light, while every customer in Maple and Honey watched in silence. Nobody said a word. Nobody moved. 4 minutes later, 6 black SUVs rolled into the parking lot. The town of Ashcroft, Virginia didn't ask to be on anyone's way to anywhere. It sat between 2 larger cities, like a forgotten footnote, the kind of place you passed through without meaning to stop. The main street had a hardware store, a post office, a barber shop that still charged $12 for a cut, and at the corner of Elm and Route 9, a breakfast spot called Maple and Honey that had been operating under the same ownership for over a decade. The sign above the door was hand-painted. The window trim was cream-colored and slightly chipped at the edges. From the outside, it looked exactly like what it was, a small-town diner that took pride in being exactly that. Ryan Callahan pulled into the gravel lot just before 8 in the morning in a silver sedan that nobody would look twice at. The car was a rental mid-range, the kind the agency gave you when you booked the cheapest available option, without specifying a preference. He had done that on purpose. He had done most of the morning on purpose. No driver, no security detail, no assistant running 3 steps behind him with a phone in each hand. Just him, a light blue button-down shirt, dark jeans, and a leather bag that had been rolled twice and refused to look new no matter how many times it was cleaned. He had left Richmond the previous evening after a dinner meeting that ran long-checked into a highway motel under a name his assistant had used before for exactly these kinds of off-grid nights, and woken up early enough to watch the sky go from gray to gold through a window that wouldn't quite close all the way. The deal he was heading toward was in Richmond, scheduled for 11. He had time. For the first time in several weeks, he actually had time, and instead of filling it with calls or documents, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He decided to eat breakfast somewhere quiet, somewhere that had no idea who he was, and simply sit for an hour like a person who had nowhere urgent to be. Maple and Honey was the first place he saw with lights on and a menu board in the window. He parked, cut the engine, and walked to the front door with his bag over one shoulder. The bell above the door gave a small chime when he pushed it open. The inside of the diner smelled like butter and strong coffee and maple syrup warm from the dispenser. 8 tables all mismatched in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. The walls were hung with old photographs of the town and a few hand-lettered chalkboard signs advertising the specials. About half the tables were occupied, a couple near the back, sharing a plate of pancakes. 3 older men at the counter who appeared to be mid-conversation about something to do with a road closure, and a woman sitting alone near the window, already working through a stack of emails on her phone. It was the kind of place that had a regular crowd, and they all appeared to know each other. Ryan took a seat at a corner table by the front window. He set his bag on the floor beside his chair, picked up the laminated menu that was already waiting on the table, and began to read it. A waitress in her mid-20s came over within a few minutes, introduced herself as Darlene, and filled his water glass. He ordered black coffee and the eggs Benedict with a side of toast. Darlene wrote it down without ceremony and headed back toward the kitchen. The whole exchange lasted under 90 seconds and was entirely unremarkable. That was what Ryan had wanted. He leaned back in his chair and looked out the window at the street. A delivery truck was parked diagonally at the hardware store across the road. A man in a reflective vest was unloading boxes onto a dolly. The traffic light at the corner cycled through its colors without much traffic to direct. Ashcroft moved slowly in the morning, and for a few minutes, Ryan let himself move with it. He wasn't thinking about the deal. He wasn't running numbers or anticipating objections or calculating leverage. He was just watching a delivery man stack boxes on a dolly and drinking his coffee when it arrived, which tasted considerably better than he expected. He didn't notice Vanessa Reed watching him from the moment he walked through the door, But she had been. Vanessa had owned Maple and Honey for 11 years. She had worked every shift for the first 3, and even now she was on the floor 6 days a week because she didn't fully trust anyone else to run it the way she wanted it run. She knew every regular by name. She knew their orders before they sat down and their moods before they opened their mouths. She knew this town, and more importantly, she believed she knew the kind of people who belonged in it. That belief over 11 years had calcified into something she never examined too closely, a gut feeling she'd decided was the same thing as good judgment. The man at the corner table bothered her. She couldn't have explained it as a specific thing. His clothes were clean. He hadn't been rude to Darlene. He was sitting quietly reading the menu and doing absolutely nothing wrong. But he had come in alone on a Tuesday morning. He wasn't a face she recognized, and the bag on the floor next to his chair was old in a way that registered to her as shabby rather than worn. She watched him from behind the front counter and decided, with a certainty that lived somewhere below reason, that he was the wrong kind of person in the wrong kind of place. She wasn't the only one. The 3 men at the counter had noticed him too. One of them, a broad man in his 60s, named Dennis, who came in every morning and treated the counter stool like an assigned seat, leaned toward the man beside him and said something in a low voice. The second man glanced toward Ryan's table and nodded. Neither of them did anything else, but the shift in the room was subtle and real, the way a small group of people can communicate a verdict without any of them formally declaring one. Vanessa came out from behind the counter and walked to Ryan's table with the posture of someone who had decided the walk itself was a statement. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was level but not warm. "Are you waiting for someone?" Ryan looked up from his coffee. "No," he said. "Just having breakfast." "Are you from around here?" she asked. "I'm passing through," he said. "On my way to Richmond." Vanessa looked at him for a moment, the way you look at something you're deciding whether to touch. "How did you hear about us?" she asked. Ryan tilted his head slightly. It was a reasonable question for a local establishment to ask, but the tone behind it was something else. "Saw the sign from the road," he said. "Looked like a good place for breakfast." Vanessa's eyes moved to his bag on the floor, then back to his face. "We run a tab here," she said. "For new customers, we ask for a card up front. House policy." Darlene, who had just come through the kitchen door with Ryan's eggs, stopped at the edge of the pass-through and looked at Vanessa with an expression she quickly rearranged into neutral. It was not the house policy. There was no house policy like that. Darlene had been working at Maple and Honey for 2 years and had never once heard Vanessa say that to anyone. She set the plate down on the pass-through and stood still watching. Ryan reached into the front pocket of his jacket without any visible frustration and set a credit card on the table. Vanessa glanced at it. The card was black, the kind that didn't display a credit limit because the concept didn't apply. She would have had to look more closely to read the name on it, and something in her expression made it clear she didn't want to be seen doing that. She pushed it back across the table toward him. "We prefer cash," she said. "I don't have cash on me right now," Ryan said. His voice was completely calm. "The card works fine. I can also pay digitally if that's easier." Vanessa looked out toward the counter where Dennis and his companion were watching with open interest. The woman by the window had lowered her phone. The couple in the back had stopped eating. Vanessa seemed to draw something from the attention, not courage exactly, but confirmation. It felt to her like agreement, like the room was nodding along without moving. "Look," she said, dropping the thin pretense of customer service courtesy. "I'm going to be straight with you. This is a neighborhood place. We have a regular clientele. People know each other here." She gestured vaguely at the tables around her at the photographs on the walls. "I don't know you, and I don't think this is really your kind of place." The room had gone quiet enough that the sound of the coffee machine finishing its cycle was audible from across the room. Ryan looked at her steadily. He didn't raise his voice. His expression didn't change in the way she might have expected. No reddening face, no wounded look, no defensive posturing. He simply looked at her, the way someone looks at a situation they are categorizing rather than reacting to. "I'd like to finish my coffee and my breakfast," he said. "I'm not bothering anyone." Vanessa straightened. The reasonableness of his answer seemed to irritate her more than an argument would have. An argument she could have managed. Quiet dignity was harder to dismiss, so she chose not to engage with it at all. She reached across the table and picked up his coffee cup. Not roughly, but deliberately, with the measured precision of someone who had already decided the move and was simply executing it. She set the cup down on the edge of the table near his back, and then, without fully intending to knock it, or perhaps not caring whether she did, her arm caught it as she pulled back. The coffee went over the side of the table in a slow, dark arc and hit the floor. A few drops caught the leg of Ryan's jeans. "I think you need to leave," Vanessa said. Her voice had the flatness of someone who expected to be obeyed. Nobody at any of the surrounding tables said a word. Dennis at the counter looked at his coffee mug. The woman by the window looked back at her phone. Darlene stood at the pass-through, with Ryan's eggs still on the plate in front of her, and did not move. The silence in the room was the particular kind that comes not from shock, but from collective decision, the decision to not be involved, to let whatever was happening finish without requiring anything of the people watching it. Ryan looked at the coffee on the floor for a moment. Then he looked back at Vanessa, and whatever calculation he was running behind his eyes, he kept entirely to himself. He could have told her his name. He could have said the name of his company, the number of employees. It had the dollar value of the investment he was carrying in the briefcase portion of that old leather bag documentation for a deal that would affect the economic corridor between Richmond and the surrounding counties, which included the town of Ashcroft. He could have watched her expression dismantle itself in real time. He didn't. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, lifted his bag from the floor, and stood. He buttoned one button on his jacket the way a man does when he is composing himself, not because he is cold. He looked at Vanessa Reed one more time without malice, without theater, with the quiet of a man who has already decided what the moment is worth, and then he walked toward the front door. The bell above the door gave its small chime again as he pushed through it into the morning. Outside the air was cool and carried the smell of cut grass from somewhere down the street. Ryan walked to his car, set his bag in the passenger seat, and stood for a moment, with one hand resting on the roof of the sedan. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. He did not call anyone. He sent a single text message, 3 words to a number that was labeled in his contacts simply as Operations. Then he looked at his watch, registered the time, and leaned against the car with his arms folded. Inside Maple and Honey, Vanessa picked up the spilled coffee cup from the floor and set it on the nearest table. Dennis said something from the counter that made her exhale through her nose, the way people do when they want to accept a compliment without appearing to need one. The woman by the window went back to her emails. Darlene quietly carried Ryan's untouched eggs, Benedict back through the kitchen door, and said nothing to anyone. It was 8:14 in the morning. The delivery man across the street had finished stacking his boxes and was climbing back into his truck. The traffic light cycled to green for nobody in particular. The town of Ashcroft continued its slow Tuesday at the same pace it always did, entirely unaware that something had just started in the parking lot of a breakfast diner on the corner of Elm and Route 9. Ryan Callahan stood next to his rental car, checked his watch one more time, and waited. Vanessa Reed did not go back to her counter. She stood in the doorway of Maple and Honey for a moment, watching Ryan through the glass panel beside the door. This man she had just expelled from her establishment, now leaning against a rental car in her parking lot, like he had every right to be there. Something about that bothered her in a way she couldn't immediately name. He wasn't making a call. He wasn't visibly upset. He was simply standing in the morning light with his arms folded and his eyes on the middle distance, completely unbothered in the particular way that people are unbothered when they know something you don't. Vanessa had spent 11 years reading people in this diner. She told herself she was good at it. But whatever she was reading off this man right now wasn't adding up to anything she recognized, and that irritated her more than his presence ever had. She pushed through the front door and let it fall shut behind her. "You can't loiter here," she said, walking toward him across the gravel. "This is private property. The lot is for customers only." Ryan looked over at her, without straightening from the car. He said nothing. "I asked you to leave," Vanessa said. She had raised her voice just enough to carry not screaming, but pitched for an audience, which was a habit she had developed without realizing it. Inside the diner, two faces appeared at the window. Dennis had come to the glass with his coffee mug still in hand. The young woman who'd been on her phone had turned in her chair to watch. "If you're not going to move, I'll call the sheriff's office. I have every right to do that." Ryan glanced toward the street briefly, then back at her. "You should do whatever you think is right," he said. His calmness had a quality to it that she couldn't puncture, and the inability to puncture it made her reach for something sharper. She stopped a few feet away from him, close enough that the conversation was intimate, whether she wanted it to be or not, and she crossed her arms the way people do when they want to appear larger than they feel. "I don't know where you come from," she said, her voice dropping into the register people use when they want their contempt to land with weight rather than volume. "But places like this don't need people like you coming in and making everyone uncomfortable. We're a community here. We know each other. You drove in off the highway looking like you don't have $2 to rub together, and you want to sit at my tables and take up space from people who actually belong here." She gestured at the diner behind her, at the street, at the town in general. "This isn't your kind of place. Go find somewhere else." From inside, Dennis nodded almost imperceptibly at the glass. The young woman raised her phone. Ryan looked at Vanessa Reed for a long moment. There was something in his expression that was close to sadness, but not quite, more like recognition. The look of someone encountering a thing they have seen before, and had quietly hoped they might not see again. He didn't respond to what she had said. He looked at his watch, noted the time, and returned his gaze to the end of the lot where it met the road. Vanessa interpreted his silence as defeat. She turned and started back toward the diner, with her chin lifted the way people carry themselves when they believe they have just won something. She was 4 steps from the door when she heard the sound. It started as a low vibration more than a noise, the kind that precedes the actual arrival of large vehicles traveling in formation. Then the sound sharpened into the distinct diesel and rubber cadence of heavy SUVs moving at speed, and then they were there, 6 black vehicles coming off Route 9 and turning into the lot of Maple and Honey with a precision that had nothing accidental about it. They filled the available space in the gravel lot with the quiet efficiency of a maneuver that had been executed many times before, engines cutting almost simultaneously, doors opening before the dust had fully settled. The men and women who stepped out were in dark suits. Several of them wore earpieces with thin coiled cords disappearing into their collars. 2 had federal-style identification badges visible on jacket lapels. They moved with the particular kind of deliberate calm that belongs to people whose job is to make the environment around their principal as controlled as possible, and they fanned out across the lot in a pattern that was professional and unmistakable. A woman in her late 30s, dark blazer hair pulled back, broke from the group and walked directly toward Ryan. Her stride covered the distance quickly and with purpose. "Mr. Callahan," she said loud enough that the sound carried back to the doorway, where Vanessa had stopped moving entirely. "We've been looking for you. The Richmond team moved the signing up to 10:30. We need to get you on the road." The gravel lot of Maple and Honey went absolutely still. Vanessa stood at her front door with one hand resting on the frame and did not speak. Her face had the expression of someone whose internal architecture has just shifted, without warning, not a sudden collapse, but a slow, load-bearing failure. The kind where the structure is still technically standing, but nothing is where it was a moment ago. She looked at the 6 black vehicles with their government-grade plates and their suited occupants, and then she looked at the man in the dark jeans and the light blue shirt who had been leaning against a rental sedan without apparent concern for the last several minutes, and she began the process of understanding what she had done. Dennis had come to the doorway behind her. He looked at the vehicles. He looked at the woman who had just called the man by a name Dennis didn't recognize, but understood by the surrounding apparatus to belong to someone who occupied a level of the world that Ashcroft rarely encountered face to face. He stepped back from the doorway without saying anything. Inside, Darlene stood at the pass-through with a dish towel in both hands, watching through the glass. Ryan said something quietly to the woman in the blazer, his assistant or his security coordinator, or both. It wasn't immediately clear, and she nodded and turned back toward the vehicles to relay something. Ryan lifted his bag from the passenger seat of the rental and walked toward the larger SUV at the center of the formation. He didn't look back at Vanessa. He didn't need to. Every person still standing in that parking lot understood exactly what had just happened, and the understanding required no commentary from him. The door of the SUV closed. The convoy pulled out of the lot in the same orderly sequence it had arrived in, turned onto Route 9, and was gone within 40 seconds. The gravel lot of Maple and Honey was quiet again, but it was a completely different kind of quiet than it had been before, the kind that sits on a space after something irreversible has occurred in it. Vanessa went back inside and walked straight to the counter without looking at any of her customers. She didn't know the name Callahan that morning, but she would by afternoon. By the time she was locking the front door at 2 o'clock, 2 of her regulars had already texted her links. By 3, she had searched the name herself and sat at her own kitchen table reading a profile from a business publication, a photograph of Ryan Callahan at a ribbon-cutting ceremony, the same jacket, the same calm expression, and the article describing in the dispassionate language of business journalism the scope of what Callahan Group was and what it represented for the economic development of the Mid-Atlantic corridor. The investment package being considered for the Richmond-Ashcroft region was described in the article as potentially the most significant private capital injection the area had seen in 2 decades. The figure cited was in the tens of millions. She sat with that information for a long time. She might have survived the day as a private humiliation, the kind of mistake that people in small towns absorb quietly and never fully discuss, except that one of the customers inside Maple and Honey that morning had been recording on their phone from the moment Vanessa walked out into the parking lot. The video was 47 seconds long. It captured everything from Vanessa telling Ryan he looked like he didn't have $2 to rub together, to the arrival of the convoy, to the assistant calling Ryan by name and title, to Ryan getting into the SUV without a backward glance. The person who filmed it uploaded it to a regional community page that evening with a caption that asked simply whether this was how Ashcroft treated visitors. By midnight, the video had been shared several hundred times. By the following morning, it had crossed into national feeds. The comments divided quickly and then consolidated. Most of what people said about Vanessa was not printable in a family publication. A smaller portion pointed out that Ryan's wealth and position shouldn't be the relevant factor, that the humiliation would have been equally wrong if he had been exactly what Vanessa assumed he was. That particular thread got fewer responses than the outrage, but it lingered in the margins of the conversation in a way that would matter later. What accelerated the story from regional embarrassment to something considerably larger was what Ryan's legal team discovered when they began their standard review of the situation. Not because Ryan had asked them to pursue it, but because it was their job to understand the full landscape before anyone made any public statements. What they found through public records and a straightforward review of online reviews dating back several years was that Vanessa Reed had done versions of this before. Not identically, not always with the same language, but the pattern was there in the reviews. customers who described being made to feel unwelcome for reasons that had nothing to do with their behavior, incidents involving people who shared a common characteristic of appearing by Vanessa's apparent standards to not belong. Several of those reviews had been flagged by the platform as credible. Several others had been disputed and removed. Taken individually, each one was deniable. Taken together, they described a practice. The legal team didn't publish anything. They compiled the records and shared them with one journalist at a regional outlet who had already reached out for comment on the video. The journalist did the rest. Within 48 hours of the video going public, the story had a second act, a pattern of discriminatory behavior at a small-town Virginia diner documented over several years, finally visible because of a single incident that happened to involve someone whose name meant something to the financial press. Former staff members began to surface on social media, not organized, not coordinated, just individuals who had seen the video and recognized the behavior as something they had witnessed or been part of and had never had a platform to describe. One former waitress posted a short account of being instructed by Vanessa to move certain customers away from the front windows. Another described being told not to seat specific people during weekend rush hours. None of them had said anything at the time. They had needed jobs. They had not believed anyone would listen. The video gave them a reason to believe someone might. Maple and Honey's review page turned into a real-time record of public sentiment. The star average dropped from 4.2 to 1.6 in under 24 hours. A food distribution supplier quietly put their contract renewal on hold, pending review of the situation. A local business association removed Maple and Honey from its featured members page without announcement. None of these things required coordination. They happened the way things happen when a community collectively decides that association has become a liability. Vanessa watched it from her kitchen, from her phone, from the seat at her own counter. When she opened the diner on the second morning, out of stubbornness or habit, or some combination of both, fewer than a third of her usual customers came in. The ones who did mostly sat quietly and didn't make eye contact with her. Dennis was not among them. The woman by the window was not among them. The regulars who had watched in silence while she walked out to the parking lot and told Ryan Callahan that he didn't belong in a place like this. They were staying home, and Vanessa understood without anyone having to say it directly that their staying home was itself a statement. She stood behind her counter on that second morning and looked at the hand-painted sign above the door, the cream-colored window trim that was slightly chipped at the edges, the mismatched tables she had arranged and rearranged over 11 years until they were exactly where she wanted them. She looked at all of it, and for the first time in a long time, she tried to see it the way someone else might see it, not as a place she had built, with her own effort and her own judgment, but as a place where the wrong decision had been made quietly and repeatedly, in plain sight of everyone who had come through the door. The realization that arrived was not comfortable and was not quick, but it arrived. The Richmond signing happened at 10:43 that morning, 11 minutes behind the revised schedule in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building with a view of the James River. Ryan sat at the head of the table in a suit that his assistant had brought in a garment bag from the lead SUV, signed where he was asked to sign, and shook hands with 7 people who had spent months working toward this moment. The room had the specific energy of a deal that had been a long time coming. Cautious relief, professional satisfaction, the kind of quiet celebration that people in finance allow themselves before the next thing begins. Ryan was present for all of it. He answered questions, accepted congratulations, made the appropriate remarks about what the partnership represented and what it would take to execute well. He did everything the moment required. But some part of his attention was still in a gravel parking lot in Ashcroft, standing next to a rental sedan, watching a woman tell him what kind of person he was, based on the bag on his shoulder, and the fact that nobody in the room had recognized his face. He had driven away from Maple and Honey, and let the convoy absorb him back into the apparatus of his ordinary life. and he had told himself on the road to Richmond that the morning was over and he was moving forward. That was what he normally did. That was how he had built everything he had, by not carrying things longer than they were useful to carry. But this one was not releasing the way he expected it to, and on the elevator ride down from the 14th floor, with his assistant already on her phone coordinating the afternoon, Ryan understood why. It wasn't Vanessa Reed specifically. It wasn't the coffee on his jeans, or the tone of her voice, or even the specific words she had used, though none of those things were without weight. It was the room. It was the 8 tables and the half-dozen people in them who had watched without moving, who had looked at him in the corner and collectively decided that what was happening to him was acceptable, or at minimum, not their problem. It was Darlene at the pass-through with his eggs not moving. It was Dennis at the counter with his coffee mug watching with something that was uncomfortably close to satisfaction. The room had rendered a verdict on him before he finished his first cup of coffee, and every person in that room had either contributed to it or consented to it by doing nothing at all. He had been in that position before, not in that diner, not with those specific people, but in rooms where he was invisible, or worse, where he was visible in the wrong way. After the divorce, in the years when he was rebuilding, and had not yet rebuilt, there had been mornings that looked not entirely unlike this one. He had walked into places with nothing announcing him, and he had felt the quality of a room's attention shift toward him, and then away in a particular direction that had nothing to do with who he was, and everything to do with what people decided they were looking at. He had learned to move through those moments without letting them show. He had become very good at it. So good, in fact, that this morning he had almost managed to absorb the whole thing silently and drive away. Almost. His legal team reached him by phone before he was back at the hotel. They had already begun the background review. This was standard, when anything unusual intersected with a principal at Ryan's level, and the picture they were developing from public records and review platforms was not a minor one. The lead counsel, a methodical man named Grant, who had been with Callahan Group for 9 years, laid out the pattern without editorializing. The incidents, the timeline, the former employees, the reviews that had been flagged, disputed, and quietly removed. Grant did not recommend a course of action. That was not his role in these conversations. He presented the information and waited. Ryan listened to all of it without interrupting. When Grant finished, there was a stretch of quiet on the line. "Send me the file," Ryan said. "I'll read it tonight." He did read it that night in a hotel room in Richmond, with the city spread out below the window, sitting at the desk, in the same dark jeans he'd been wearing all day, with the coffee stain still faintly visible near the knee. He read through the documentation slowly, not looking for ammunition, though it was clearly available, but trying to understand the full shape of what had been happening in that small diner on the corner of Elm and Route 9 over the span of years. The pattern in the reviews was unmistakable once you were looking for it. The former employees' accounts were credible and specific. Taken together, they described not a single bad morning, but a sustained practice, quiet and consistent, hidden in plain sight inside a business that served the public and considered itself a community institution. Ryan closed the file and sat back in the chair. He could end Maple and Honey completely and permanently. He had the documentation, the legal standing, the public momentum, and the financial weight to pursue it in a way that would leave nothing standing. There were people on his staff who would have considered this the appropriate response, proportionate to the provocation, defensible on the record, and useful as a public deterrent. The internet had already largely arrived at that conclusion without his involvement. The comments under the video were, if anything, ahead of him in terms of appetite for total destruction. He thought about what it would mean to be the instrument of that. He thought about Vanessa Reed, sitting at her own counter on the second morning, with fewer than a third of her regulars coming in, and what it felt like to sit in a place you had built and watch people decide that your presence in it was a problem. He had felt something like that once. Not the same thing, not in the same context, not for the same reasons, but the particular quality of being looked at in a room and found wanting. He had not forgotten what that felt like, and he didn't think using the memory as a reason to go easier on Vanessa would be honest. But he also didn't think it gave him the right to be the one who finished her off when the public was already doing a thorough job without him. There was a version of justice that looked like power asserting itself in proportion to how it was disrespected. Ryan understood that version. He had used it before in business, in negotiations, in rooms where the other party had underestimated him and needed to learn the cost of that. But this was not a negotiation, and Vanessa Reed was not a rival. She was a woman who had made a serious mistake in a way that had now been witnessed by the entire country, and the question of what Ryan Callahan did next was going to say something about what he believed justice was actually for. He made his decision before he went to sleep. It felt less like a decision, and more like the natural resting point of everything he'd been thinking since the parking lot. The brief press statement was prepared the following morning and released through Callahan Group's communications office at 11. Ryan did not hold a formal press conference. He had his communications director read the statement to the half-dozen journalists who had gathered outside the Richmond office, and he stood slightly to the side where he was visible, but not the focal point in the same plain clothes he had worn to Ashcroft. The statement was short. It confirmed that Callahan Group was withdrawing its investment consideration from the Ashcroft corridor. It did not cite Maple and Honey by name. It did not mention Vanessa Reed. It cited in formal and measured language a need to reassess the regional environment before committing capital to communities whose governance and civic culture required further evaluation. The financial press would understand what that meant. The people of Ashcroft would understand what that meant. The single statement that Ryan delivered, himself the only line he added to the prepared text, speaking directly and without notes, was this: the way a community treats people who have no power is the truest measure of what that community actually is. He did not take questions. He returned to his work. The statement landed, the way plain things land. When the context around them is complicated, it cut through. The withdrawal of investment was a concrete consequence, measurable and real, the kind that affected budgets and timelines and planning conversations at the county level. Local officials issued responses. The Business Association published a statement of concern. The regional newspaper ran it above the fold. But what people kept sharing in the days that followed was not the financial withdrawal. It was the one sentence. It got pulled out of context and put back into context and applied to situations its speaker had not intended. It appeared on graphics with no attribution. It appeared in sermons and in newsletters and in the comment sections of completely unrelated arguments, where people were trying to make a point about how a group behaves toward its most vulnerable members. Ryan did not follow any of that. He had a company to run and a signed deal in Richmond that now required his full attention, and the Ashcroft chapter was, as far as he was concerned, closed. For Vanessa, it was not closed. It would not be closed quickly. The investigation opened by the county's business licensing office was administrative, rather than criminal, focused on the documented pattern of discriminatory service practices, rather than the single incident that had gone public. It moved slowly the way regulatory processes move with letters and response windows and scheduled hearings. Vanessa did not contest it. She had consulted a lawyer, read the file her own attorney had assembled from the same public records Ryan's team had found, and arrived at the same conclusion Ryan had arrived at the night after the signing. The shape of what had happened over the years was not deniable, and trying to deny it would make everything worse. She closed Maple and Honey 3 weeks after the video went public. The closure sign in the window said only, "Temporarily closed for renovations," which was technically true in ways that went beyond the physical. A local organization that worked on workplace equity and customer service training in small businesses had reached out through her attorney's office, and Vanessa had After several days and at least one conversation that her attorney described as the most direct he had ever witnessed between a client and a program coordinator, agreed to participate. The program ran for 6 weeks. It was not easy. It was not designed to be. What happened in those 6 weeks was not public, because it was not the public's to witness. What Vanessa said, what she acknowledged, what she found herself confronting in the space between what she had believed about herself and what the documented record of her behavior described that belonged to her and to the process, and it would not be honest to present it as a clean journey toward redemption. Transformation, when it is real, does not look clean from the inside. It looks like sitting with information you do not want, and being asked to stay with it longer than is comfortable, and not being given the relief of rushing toward a conclusion that lets you feel resolved before you have actually resolved anything. She stayed with it. That was the part that mattered. Maple and Honey reopened on a Tuesday morning in early spring, approximately 4 months after the parking lot. The exterior had been repainted. The window trim was fresh white now without the chips. The interior had been rearranged. The counter where Dennis and his companions had sat, with a clear line of sight to the front tables, was now positioned differently, not dramatically, but enough to change the sight lines. The photographs of the town were still on the walls. The chalkboard specials were still hand-lettered. The coffee machine was the same one because it still made excellent coffee, and there was no reason to replace it. Near the register on the wall at approximately eye level for someone waiting to pay their check, a small rectangular sign had been mounted on plain wood. It wasn't ornate. The lettering was clean and black on a cream background that matched the new window trim. It read, "Don't judge a person's worth by their clothes, their car, or their silence." Nobody asked Vanessa where the line came from. She had written it herself in the same handwriting she used for the chalkboard specials, and she had not explained it to anyone. She didn't need to. Most of the people who came in on the first morning back could not have told you exactly what had happened in the parking lot. 4 months earlier, the details had blurred the way viral stories blur once the cycle moves on. But they could feel, in the changed arrangement of the room and the changed quality of the way Vanessa greeted people at the door, that something had shifted. They couldn't have named it precisely. They accepted the coffee and the eggs and the warmth at face value the way people accept small improvements when they are genuine. Darlene came back. She had taken a job at a breakfast counter 20 minutes up the road during the closure and had not been sure she would return, but she did because the commute was longer and because something in Vanessa's voice when she called to offer the position back had been different from anything she had heard in 2 years of working for her. She couldn't have defined it beyond that. Different was enough. Dennis did not come back. He had found another counter to sit at and appeared content. Some things rearrange themselves and do not return, and that is part of it too. Ryan Callahan completed the Richmond deal and moved to the next one. He gave no further public statements about Ashcroft. He did not revisit the town, not because he was avoiding it, but because he had no reason to go back. The morning at Maple and Honey became one of the stories he carried the way people carry certain memories, not at the surface, not defining, but present and occasionally useful. When he sat in rooms where someone was being underestimated based on what they looked like or how they arrived, which happened more often than the world liked to admit, he thought about a gravel parking lot and a man leaning against a rental car, and how long 4 minutes could feel when you were waiting for something you already knew was coming. He thought also about the people at the tables who had not moved, about the specific architecture of silence in a room where everyone has made a collective decision to not be involved. That architecture was not unique to Ashcroft, and it was not unique to Vanessa Reed. It showed up everywhere that people had the option to speak and chose the path that cost them the least. He didn't have a solution to it. He didn't carry the morning as a lesson he intended to teach anyone. He carried it the way honest people carry the things they have witnessed, as a reminder of what people are capable of in both directions, and of how much it matters in any given moment, which direction you choose. The sign near the register at Maple and Honey stayed on the wall. Customers photographed it sometimes and posted it without much context, and it traveled across the internet in the way that plain, honest sentences travel when they land on something people already know but have not found the right words for. It accumulated meaning gradually, the way small things do when they are true. The town of Ashcroft continued. The traffic light at Elm and Route 9 cycled through its colors. The hardware store across the road got a new awning in late summer. The barbershop still charged what it charged and showed no signs of changing. Life in a small town moves slowly, and it absorbs large events by pressing them down into the ordinary and continuing forward, which is not the same as forgetting. It is something closer to integration, taking what happened and finding a way to live with it that is different from the way you lived before, even if the difference is not always visible from the outside. The bell above the door of Maple and Honey still chimed when it opened. That part had not changed, and it did not need to.